The Ecowas Court of Justice, seated in Abuja, Nigeria, concluded its review of the application filed by Nnamdi Kanu's legal team against the governments of Kenya and Nigeria. After examining the written submissions, oral arguments, affidavits, and supporting evidence presented during the hearings, the court...
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are hearing me from. Still your one and only Okute Daily Talk. This information is dropping early this morning. And it says, and I quote, yesterday, okay, let me use that word yesterday, because it is my morning already. Maybe you are still in your yesterday. But the information dropped as late as 7 hours ago. That's around 1 a.m. of my time. 1 a.m. of my time, which is 7 p.m. Nigerian time. So, and it says that the Ecowas court, they don't rule in Abuja yesterday, and the ruling is that they demand the immediate release of Mazen Nnamdi Kanu. That is number one. Compensation from Nigerian government. That is number two. And another compensation from Kenya government. That is number three. Please verify this information from any online newspapers, because a lot of quarters broadcasted this message. Anyway, I will not wait most of your time, because most of us have been complaining that I talk too much. I will just withhold whatever I have to say. Let us listen to this message completely, and then I will come back here to air my own view. But the take back home on this message is that the Ecowas court have ruled in favor of Mazen Nnamdi Kanu, in favor of Biafrans, and in favor of IPOB, indigenous people of Biafra. Oyana, let us listen to this. But before then, have a nice day. Chineke jike niile Chukwu oke abịama, gọziere m gị na anụ onu m, mana ụtụtụ, mana ehihie, mana abalị. Asa agụpụ ụzọ agụpụ ọnụ. Mmiri atara azụ anwụ na ihe ọma ya emere anyị na-eke n'orie na afọ na nkwụ. Ihe ọbụla anyị tinyere aka n'ụbọchị nke taata wee na-aga n'iru. Chukwu oke abịama, biko gọziere m onye ukwu, gọziere m onye nta. N'afa Nna na Nwa na nke Mmụọ Nsọ. It is well with our soul. Let us listen to this message. And this is our first publication of today. Be the first to comment, and also be the first to like and share. There's a reward for everything. I am not a kind of person that when I promise I don't do. Don't worry. I am calculating. I repeat, I am calculating. I am taking record of everything. Not that I am trying to kind of make some people to bend. No, please. That is not my intention. But don't forget that every laborer deserves his or her wages. Mbosenta anyachono werenchi.
Delivered its judgment on the lawfulness of the arrest, detention, and transfer. In its ruling, the Ecowas court declared that the manner in which Nnamdi Kanu was arrested and detained in Kenya, followed by his transfer to Nigeria in June 2021, violated fundamental human rights protections under the Ecowas Revised Treaty and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The court found that both respondent states failed to adhere to established standards for cross-border law enforcement cooperation. Specifically, it held that the absence of a formal extradition process, judicial oversight in Kenya, and proper notification of rights rendered the operation an arbitrary deprivation of liberty. The judgment detailed several key violations. First, the court ruled that Kanu's initial detention in Kenya lacked prompt judicial review and access to legal representation, breaching Article 6 of the African Charter, which guarantees the right to liberty and security of the person and prohibits arbitrary arrest or detention. Second, the transfer itself was deemed inconsistent with regional obligations because it bypassed extradition treaties and domestic laws of both countries. The court emphasized that member states cannot engage in or facilitate extraordinary rendition without due process, even when addressing security concerns. This action, the judgment stated, undermined the principles of mutual respect for sovereignty and the rule of law that underpin Ecowas integration. On the question of state responsibility, the Ecowas court determined...
Please, I beg you, don't get tired of hearing good news. Rather, get tired of hearing bad news, because some people will also come to counter this message that they have been hearing this thing for a very long time. My brother, road to success is very narrow. It is never straight. In other words, road to your freedom, my brother, a lot of thorns, anaconda, a lot. In fact, you are going to meet a lot of things. Don't forget, according to what the Bible told us, in the wilderness, trekking from Egypt to Israel, the Israelites, you can see how many years it takes them. 40 years and 40 days and 40 nights. 40 years or 40 days and 40 nights. My brother, what up to them? Now them trek am, not me trek am. So I don't know anything about whether 40 days or 40 years. I beg, let us continue.
Kenya, as the territorial state where Konu was present, had a duty to protect his rights and ensure compliance with legal procedures before any removal. Nigeria, for its part, bore responsibility for accepting and detaining an individual brought through irregular means. The court rejected arguments that national security imperatives could wholly override these procedural safeguards, noting that such exceptions must still comply with ratified human rights instruments. Regarding remedies, the judgment ordered the Nigerian government to take immediate steps toward Konu's release from detention. It further directed both states to pay compensation for the material and moral damages suffered as a result of the violations. The amount was to be assessed based on the duration of the incommunicado detention.
Do you know that this is not the first time Ecowas court have been ruling on this case of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu? Do you know that African Union wants the Nigerian government to seek a political solution to end the trial of Mazi Nnamdi Kanu? They never listened. Do you also remember that the what I call it, United Nations Human Rights on Arbitrary Detention issued 6 months at least maximum for Buhari to release Mazi Nnamdi Kanu. That 6 months is turning to 6 years now. Nothing has been done. Nigerian government refused to listen. When you ask now, they will tell you that this country is a sovereign nation. Who made them a sovereign nation? They are not even a nation to start with. Who made them a sovereign nation? That is my question. Because that is what they keep. The excuse is this, all these charlatans that call themselves first world countries, they keep arguing it's a sovereign nation. Who made Nigeria a sovereign nation? Nigeria is not yet a nation. Nigeria is just a geographical expression. So who made Nigeria a sovereign nation? I want to know. So please don't get tired of hearing good news.
Health impacts and interference with legal defense preparations. The court also issued declaratory relief, confirming that any ongoing proceedings in Nigeria built directly on the unlawful transfer could not proceed without addressing the foundational rights breaches. It stressed that the doctrine of male captus being detentus, the idea that an irregular capture does not affect subsequent jurisdiction, does not apply when core human rights are flagrantly violated in a manner that shocks the conscience of the regional community. The ruling highlighted broader implications for Ecowas member states. It served as a reminder that transnational security operations must respect harmonized human rights standards to maintain trust in regional cooperation frameworks. The court referenced its own prior jurisprudence on arbitrary detention and state accountability, reinforcing consistency in how it interprets community law. By holding both governments jointly responsible, the decision underscored the interconnected nature of obligations in a regional economic community where free movement and human rights are central pillars. In the post-judgment phase, the Ecowas court addressed enforcement mechanisms available under its protocol. Judgments of the court are binding on member states, and the ruling urged Nigeria and Kenya to comply promptly to avoid further proceedings for non-compliance. It called on the Ecowas authority of heads of state and government to monitor implementation where necessary, aligning with the community's commitment to the rule of law as a foundation for peace and integration. Legal analysts noted that the decision clarified important boundaries. While states retain the right to pursue individuals accused of serious offenses, they must do so through transparent legal channels. The judgment did not delve into the merits of charges against Konu in Nigeria, but focused exclusively on the rendition process itself. This narrow scope allowed the court to issue a clear pronouncement on procedural legality without encroaching on domestic criminal jurisdiction. The outcome was hailed by human rights observers as a significant affirmation of individual protections against state overreach in cross-border contexts. It provided CONU's legal team with a regional precedent to support further domestic challenges and international advocacy. For the governments involved, it represented a call to review internal protocols on international cooperation to prevent future similar findings. The Ecowas Court's ruling stands as a documented judicial pronouncement on the events of June 2021. It affirmed that extraordinary rendition without due process contravenes community law and carries consequences, including orders for release and compensation. The decision reinforces the expectation that Ecowas member states uphold the African Charter and related instruments in all law enforcement activities, domestic or transnational. The lawyers relied on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which both countries have ratified and domesticated. They cited specific provisions: Article 6 on the right to liberty and security of the person, prohibiting arbitrary arrest or detention; Article 7 on the right to a fair hearing; and Article 5 on the prohibition of torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The team argued that CONU's apprehension in Kenya occurred without a valid warrant or judicial oversight under Kenyan law, and he was held without immediate access to legal counsel, family, or consular services, conditions that amounted to arbitrary detention. A central pillar of the arguments was the absence of any formal extradition process. The legal team presented evidence that no extradition request had been filed with Kenyan authorities, no court in Kenya had approved the removal, and no bilateral or multilateral treaty procedures under the Extradition Act or relevant international conventions were followed. Instead, the transfer was executed through covert cooperation between security operatives of the two states. This, they submitted, violated the principle of state sovereignty and the requirement for due process in cross-border movements of individuals. The filing referenced Ecowas protocols on free movement and human rights, emphasizing that member states cannot circumvent established legal channels even in security-related matters. CONU's counsel further contended that Kenya, as the territorial state, bore responsibility for failing to protect CONU while he was lawfully present on its soil. Once detained, the Kenyan authorities did not ensure compliance with basic safeguards such as prompt judicial review or notification of rights. The transfer to Nigeria compounded the violation because Nigeria accepted and detained him based on this irregular process. The arguments highlighted that such rendition practices undermine the rule of law and regional integration goals of Ecowas, which include harmonized standards for justice and human rights protection. On the impact side, the legal team submitted that the manner of rendition directly affected CONU's ability to prepare a defense in any Nigerian proceedings.
Yes.
Prolonged incommunicado holding prevented effective consultation with lawyers and impaired health and well-being.
Yeah, so they are right in all their assertions. The manner in which Mazen Nnamdi Kanu was brought back to Nigeria, they never give him chance to even have a lawyer or to prepare his defense well. And people are out there blaming, why must he chase out his lawyers? Anyway, you people don't understand how this game is being played.
Reaching fair trial guarantees. They requested declarations of unlawfulness for each stage: arrest, detention in Kenya, and transfer, along with orders for immediate release and monetary compensation calibrated to the duration and severity of the violations. Expert opinions on international rendition standards were tendered to show consistency with global jurisprudence rejecting male captus being detentus, wrongly captured but properly detained, as a blanket justification when fundamental rights are at stake. The respondents, Kenya and Nigeria, presented counterarguments centered on national security imperatives and sovereign discretion in handling individuals wanted for serious offenses. Nigerian representatives maintained that the operation was a lawful repatriation to face justice and that any irregularities did not strip courts of jurisdiction over the underlying matters. Kenyan submissions addressed border control responsibilities and cooperation with regional partners. CONU's team rebutted these by insisting that security concerns cannot override explicit treaty obligations or constitutional protections. They pointed to precedents within Ecowas jurisprudence where the court had held states accountable for similar cross-border actions lacking due process. Throughout the hearings, the focus stayed strictly legal. Affidavits detailing timelines of entry into Kenya, circumstances of initial contact with authorities, periods of unacknowledged detention, and the mechanics of the flight to Nigeria were central. The lawyers avoided extraneous political commentary, grounding every point in ratified instruments. The Ecowas revised treaty, the African Charter, incorporated into Nigerian law via the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Ratification and Enforcement, Act, and parallel Kenyan constitutional provisions. They stressed the erga omnes nature of human rights obligations, binding on all member states regardless of bilateral relations. Additional arguments addressed remedies. Beyond release and compensation, the team sought orders directing both states to refrain from future similar actions and to align practices with community law. They referenced the court's power under its protocol to issue binding judgments enforceable within the Ecowas framework, positioning the case as an opportunity to clarify standards for transnational law enforcement cooperation. The proceedings tested the balance between state security powers and individual protections in a regional context. CONU's legal team maintained that allowing rendition without process would erode confidence in Ecowas institutions and set a dangerous precedent for other citizens moving across member state borders. Evidence was methodical. Flight records, entry documentation, medical reports on post-transfer condition, and legal opinions on treaty interpretation. The case underscored that even high-profile security targets retain fundamental rights that states must observe collectively.
Even as Ecowas court have declared immediate release of Mazen Nnamdi Kanu with compensation and abeg, Nigerians are still hiring and firing judges, recusing and accepting judges who is going to sit on the appeal, on the appeal of Mazen Nnamdi Kanu over the life sentence that have been handed over to him. Where you see a banana republic in the name of a country, you will know Nigeria is one of them.
This phase of the litigation remained narrowly tailored to the rendition facts, allowing the Ecowas court to examine compliance with community law without adjudicating domestic charges in Nigeria. Straight to the Ecowas court ruling. The Ecowas Court of Justice, having reviewed all submissions and evidence, ruled that the arrest, detention, and transfer of Nnamdi Kanu from Kenya to Nigeria were unlawful. The judgment held that the actions violated Kanu's fundamental human rights under the African Charter and Ecowas instruments. It ordered his release from detention and required compensation to be paid for the violations. The court affirmed that extraordinary rendition bypassing due process and extradition requirements contravenes regional standards and cannot lawfully support continued detention or related proceedings. Both states were reminded of their obligations to uphold rule of law procedures in cross-border operations. Following the delivery of the Ecowas Court of Justice judgment declaring the arrest, detention, and transfer of Nnamdi Kanu from Kenya to Nigeria unlawful, the court transitioned into the enforcement phase of its ruling. Under the Protocol on the Community Court of Justice, Ecowas judgments are binding on member states, and the court issued formal demands to the governments of Nigeria and Kenya to ensure full compliance. These demands centered on the immediate release of Kanu, payment of compensation, and adherence to the legal standards outlined in the decision. The Ecowas court communicated its orders through official diplomatic and judicial channels to the relevant authorities in both countries. The ruling explicitly required the Nigerian government to facilitate Kanu's release from custody, emphasizing that continued detention predicated on the irregular rendition process could not be
A stubborn grasshopper will always end up in the gizzard of a bird. Nigeria, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, and every other cabals playing stubborn, playing this ostrich game on this case of Mazen Nnamdi Kanu is going to learn the hard way.
Reconciled with community human rights obligations. The court referenced provisions in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, particularly those safeguarding liberty and prohibiting arbitrary deprivation of freedom, to underscore the urgency of the demand. Enforcement proceedings highlighted the court's authority to monitor implementation. The judgment included a directive for both states to report back on compliance measures within a specified period. This mechanism allows the court to track progress and address any delays through additional hearings if necessary. For Nigeria, as the detaining state, the primary obligation involved taking concrete steps to end the custody arrangements stemming from the 2021 events. The demand extended to reparations, with the court calling for assessment and payment of compensation covering material damages, such as legal costs and health-related impacts, as well as moral damages arising from the period of incommunicado detention and restricted access to counsel. Kenya, for its role in the initial apprehension and transfer, received parallel notifications requiring acknowledgement of the procedural lapses and commitments to prevent recurrence in future cross-border operations. The Ecowas court stressed that member states share collective responsibility in upholding the rule of law within the regional community. This includes ensuring that security cooperation respects extradition protocols, judicial oversight, and fundamental rights protections embedded in the Ecowas revised treaty and associated instruments. CONU's legal team responded promptly by filing compliance applications and follow-up motions before the Ecowas court. These submissions referenced the binding nature of the judgment and requested interim measures to safeguard CONU's well-being pending full implementation. The lawyers argued that the Ecowas demand for freedom represented a clear legal imperative, separate from any domestic charges, and rooted in evidence of violations during the rendition process. They positioned the enforcement phase as critical for reinforcing the credibility of regional judicial institutions. The broader Ecowas framework supports these demands through involvement of the Ecowas Commission and, where required, the authority of heads of state and government. Non-compliance can trigger further community-level actions, including referrals for political or diplomatic engagement to encourage adherence. Legal experts following the case noted that such enforcement steps test the practical effectiveness of human rights adjudication in the region, particularly in matters involving high-profile security cases. In its communications, the court reiterated key principles from the main judgment. Extraordinary rendition without due process contravenes established standards and cannot serve as a lawful basis for ongoing detention. It rejected broad interpretations of national security that would nullify treaty obligations, affirming that procedural safeguards apply universally to all individuals within member state jurisdictions or under their effective control. The demand for release was framed as restorative justice, aimed at rectifying the foundational breaches identified in the arrest in Kenya, the lack of access to rights during detention, and the irregular transfer across borders. Observers documented the post-ruling developments, with CONU's counsel issuing public statements focused on legal adherence rather than political commentary. They highlighted prior Ecowas jurisprudence on similar issues of arbitrary detention and state accountability, drawing parallels to reinforce the consistency of the current demands. The legal strategy involved preparing detailed compliance timelines, evidence of ongoing effects of the violations, and proposals for calculating appropriate compensation based on international benchmarks for human rights remedies. This enforcement chapter of the case underscores the role of the Ecowas court as a supranational body tasked with harmonizing justice standards across West Africa. By demanding CONU's freedom, the court reinforced expectations that transnational law enforcement must align with ratified human rights norms. It also provided a precedent for other individuals facing similar cross-border challenges, promoting greater scrutiny of rendition practices among member states. As proceedings in the enforcement phase advanced, the focus remained on measurable outcomes, verifiable release, financial reparations, and systemic adjustments in bilateral security protocols between Nigeria and Kenya. The Ecowas court maintained oversight, ready to convene additional sessions to evaluate progress or issue further directives. CONU's team continued to engage constructively within the legal framework, submitting updates and requesting acceleration where delays emerged. The demand for freedom thus forms an integral extension of the original ruling. It shifts emphasis from adjudication of facts to execution of remedies, highlighting both the strengths and challenges of regional human rights enforcement. Compliance would demonstrate commitment to community law, while any reported obstacles could prompt deeper institutional dialogue within Ecowas structures. This phase remains active in the official records, centered on the court's authority to enforce its decisions on unlawful arrest, detention, and transfer. It provides a factual basis for ongoing advocacy grounded in judicial pronouncements, without extending into unrelated domestic matters. Scanner PDF.
That is the end of Solomon Grande. And that is the end of the message. We don't have much time again. We cannot read the comment. Let me just put it that we cannot read the comment. But at this point, I am signing out. Let me know what you think at the comment section. Drop your thoughts. Kachineke mezioku.